Okay, guys, welcome back to 1302. This is going to be our last video lecture in terms of what you need to prepare for the final exam, the age of limits. Just to kind of set this up for us, the United States is kind of in the middle of a deep turmoil. We've had the experience of the Vietnam War. We've seen our government lie to us in the Pentagon Papers, and we've seen our first ever president resign. And there's a deep and genuine sadness, I think, over much of the country over these events. So America is going to need some healing during this time, and you combine that with kind of a stop. And the reason I call this the age of limits is this is kind of the limit of our economic prosperity. You know, ever since World War II, the United States has assumed the world's largest economy, and we just assumed that this would just keep going on forever, continuous improvement forever. The standard of living and happiness would generally just go up and up and up. But that's not, unfortunately, going to happen. Because partly from the turmoil of the 1960s and 1970s, partly because of the loss of Vietnam, the Watergate scandal, kind of all of these problems together devastated the morale of the country. And we combine that with an aging economy and we'll see some fuel shortages and some increased competition abroad. The party that had began at the end of World War II had finally come to an end. We're going to begin by taking a look at Gerald Ford's administration. We mentioned last time that Nixon resigned as a result of the smoking gun tapes becoming public and the Watergate scandal kind of coming to fruition. And so a new president is sworn in the day after he resigns. But Gerald Ford was not Nixon's vice president. Gerald Ford was the Speaker of the House. The reason for that, and the reason he becomes president, is because the original vice president is a man named Spiro T. Agnew. And Agnew had to resign in scandal, a completely different scandal, a completely unrelated scandal to the Watergate system. This is a scandal that dated back to his time as a politician in Maryland, governor of Maryland. He was accepting cash bribes in envelopes in exchange for building contracts to various times, government building contracts. He had been doing it for years. The Justice Department started the investigation in Maryland. It went all the way up to the White House. While he was vice president, he was still accepting cash bribes. If you're interested about this story, there's a very good podcast about it called Bagman, Bagman. You can Google that or search that in podcasts and hear the whole Spiro T. Agnew story. It's really quite fantastic. But so they make a deal essentially with him that if he will admit to tax fraud, because, you know, if you're accepting cash bribes, you're not paying taxes on those cash bribes. So tax evasion is kind of what came out in the news at the time, and in exchange for resigning the vice presidency. So plead guilty for tax fraud, resign the vice presidency, and all of the rest of the stuff kind of got buried. So when Ford takes office, and we talked about this in the last video, the first thing he does is pardon Nixon for any and all crimes. And he does this much to the anger, honestly, of some people, but he does this for good reasons. He just wants it to be over. Had he not pardoned Nixon, the Watergate investigation would have gone on, and they would have uncovered who knows how many other sins committed by the president, right? So because he pardoned him for anything he could have, might have, should have committed, then it's over. The Watergate investigation is over. And as he said quite famously, our long national nightmare has finally ended. So who was Gerald Ford? Well, he had no ambitions of ever becoming president. He was a Congress guy. He wanted to be in Congress, and he wanted to be the height of Congress, which is the Speaker of the House, and he'd finally gotten that position when he is thrust into the presidency. He is a sharp contrast of the slick and polished Richard Nixon. He is not slick and polished. He is much more of a down-to-earth kind of guy. He was a college football player from the University of Michigan. One of my funnest facts about Gerald Ford is instead of playing Hail to the Chief when he would walk into the room, he had the band, the Marine band, play the Michigan fight song for him so he could relive his glory days as a college football player. He probably suffered from concussions. One of the senators joked that he played football too many times without his helmet on. So he probably had the concussion symptoms that we know all too well today that happens to football players. He would forget things, have lapse of memory. He would also fall down for no good reason, like just be walking and just fall over, right? But I think he's a genuinely good person. He kind of had this aw shucks mentality, kind of this very kind of honest demeanor about him. And so in that way, he very much could have been a healer for our nation. And that, of course, was not an easy thing to do. Don't underestimate how emotionally hurt and cynical the Watergate scandal made the American people. People thought that their president had made a mockery out of every ounce of trust and power the people had given him. And the fact that we got over that somewhat during his presidency, Ford deserves a lot of credit. Unfortunately, otherwise, Ford's time in office is pretty much spent dealing with one economic crisis after another. See, it was about the time that Nixon came into office that the economic party was finally coming to an end. For 3 decades, the United States had led the world in just about every economic category you could muster. Starting with World War II, it seems like the economy just kept growing and growing and growing for about 30 years. And people had started to take this for granted. But that prosperity started to disappear in the 1970s. Now, we didn't just have a little setback. We were going to have a full-out recession from 1974 and 1975. And what's going to cause this recession are going to be 3 predominant factors: inflation, increased competition, and shortages of a very important resource. So we'll talk about each one of these 3 things individually. Now, inflation had been building up for years. Around the last years of Nixon's term, in the first year of Ford's, it started to hit crisis levels. Lyndon Johnson had financed much of his programs through inflation, especially the Vietnam War. And near the end of Johnson's term, it really started to catch up to him. Then, inflation got a lot worse under Nixon's term, in large part because Nixon's policies. In 1971, Nixon ended the gold standard for U.S. currency. Before that, the idea of a dollar referred to a specific amount of gold. There wasn't necessarily actual gold behind it, but that's how people knew the dollar was worth something. The gold standard really was just an arbitrary way of measuring something that needs a measuring stick. It was a standard. America just as easily have said that the dollar was worth a certain amount of cotton candy. It didn't matter what it was as long as you had something that helped people have an idea of what the dollar was worth. That idea for America for a long, long time was gold. Nixon decided instead that he was going to let the dollar float. From 1971 right up till today, we still do this today, there's really nothing stable to determine how much a dollar is worth. The only way to measure it is by seeing how it compares to other countries, which do the same thing. They compare their currency to other countries. So, for example, if Germany is willing to accept 1 American dollar as payment for something that cost 2 Deutschmarks, well then, the American dollar, $1, is worth 2 Deutschmarks. If an American dollar, 1 American dollar, in Japan will buy something worth 10,000 yen, well then, the dollar, $1, is worth 10,000 yen. So Nixon made the dollar entirely dependent on trade, which is not really a bad idea for a country that was doing a lot of trading. People in Japan and Germany didn't care if a dollar represented gold. After Nixon took away the gold standard, they did care, though, how it related to their own currency. It was easier to transfer and it was easier to understand. So going off the gold standard made international commerce easier at the time. When international commerce was becoming more and more important. But it also meant that the dollar was much less stable. Without a yardstick like the gold standard, the dollar could just go as high or as low as the international markets made it. Maybe it was worth 10,000 yen, or maybe it was worth 1,000 yen. And no country had complete control over that, including our own country. It was just a question of abstract economic forces. And in the 1970s, right after Nixon started floating the currencies, those international forces said that our dollar wasn't worth very much. That led to inflation. Secondly, international competition. Another cause of our economic crisis was, of course, international competition. And that means in manufacturing. One of the reasons why U.S. manufacturing kept prospering for so long after World War II is because all of the other countries that did manufacturing were devastated by the war. The war largely took place in Europe and in Asia. And it took those countries a long time to rebuild after the war. But by 1970, Western Europe and Japan had recovered from the destruction of World War II and had started to catch up with the United States. Cars, steel, all sorts of products started competing with U.S.-made goods both in world markets and within the United States. And helping with that process happened even faster from 1972 was the fact that the U.S. finally opened up trade relations with China. And ever since, more and more stuff that America buys comes from China. I probably don't need to have to tell you that. As a result, over the course of the 1970s, the United States basically deindustrialized. Some American corporations failed, and those that survived did so by restructuring themselves to compete in a new marketplace. Companies closed old plants, they moved a lot of labor overseas, and thus eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs that created such a prosperous post-war working class and high wages. Thousands of manufacturing interests closed. Millions of people lost their jobs. And the people who kept their jobs got paid less and had fewer benefits. That meant that the high-wage, high-employment economy that had been a central fact of American life since the 1970s started to disappear. Full employment was no longer possible. And people buying things would actually send money out to support countries that made it from other countries. So from that point till today, the U.S. has really been reckoning with what kind of economy we should have and where things should be made. And that's going to lead us to our third and final section of all this, which is going to be shortages. And we will talk about, I'm almost out of time here, so we will talk about shortages in our next video.